Hi everyone, so here we are for the final unit, chapter 23. We're going to be looking at human evolution, and we've got 3 parts to this particular chapter. So the origin of life, as science can describe it, began with chemical evolution. And chemical evolution is basically saying, okay, when we've got a bunch of chemicals and just individual atoms sitting in a warm area and we add some electricity, they can form, and we can call it spontaneous. I mean, there is electricity, so that, I guess, using that word is up to you, but they will then form small organic molecules. And the Stanley Miller experiment is what we see in the image to the right. And this was the experiment that first showed that this was even possible. We had sort of hypothesized about it, and so finally we were able to take some little molecules, and we were able to or not molecules, excuse me, gases. Gases were over here, and we knew that early Earth, based on some geology, we knew that early Earth was very warm and there was some electricity, think of lightning, and so we boiled water over here, and then that steam was able to travel over here to add, so we've got some water, we've got some steam, we have some electrodes adding electric sparks, and we have these gases, and then those are just, this kind of system just runs on its own, and then there's cold water in this condenser, so the gases, as they move through that cold area, will condense. They'll no longer be gases, and then when they hit this solid water right here, if there's anything that's larger, it'll sink to the bottom. It won't be able to float in water, and that's what happened. We let this experiment run for a while and then came back, and small organic molecules that had not been put in there had formed, just as because there had been enough heat and there had been electricity, and these particular gases that are listed up here. So this was the first experiment that said, hey, this is even possible. So if we know that that's possible, that Stanley Miller experiment got us here. That kind of showed that this step of going from inorganic chemicals to organic molecules was possible. And we've done other experiments since then. We won't make you memorize the names of all of them, but other experiments to show that when those organic molecules are next to each other, they align themselves into polymers. Remember that word, a big long chain of something. So that's how we get carbs and proteins and nucleic acids. And then if certain phospholipids organize themselves, and then they just always do this because of that polar and nonpolar part, we can get a plasma membrane going on. And so what we saw over history is now we've kind of crossed into biological evolution, where we finally have something called a protocell, because it has a membrane and there's some things inside, but it's not necessarily what we've called a proper cell, where it has genetic material and all of these kind of division of labor pieces. But this is kind of that very, very, very early evolution going on, long before anything complicated was on the planet. This was 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. All of our sciences support that approximate date, and then we had chemical evolution followed by biological evolution, getting us to those first cells. So from cells, now remember cells are that unit of life, and so now that we have cells, we have living or biological evolution. And biological evolution has a really simple definition. For some people it seems controversial, but the definition itself is right here. It's just a change in a population over time. That's it. If you notice that a population in 1900 had an average height of 5 feet. Obviously, I'm making up the numbers, but if they had an average height of 5 feet and you came back in 2000 and you saw that the average height was 5 feet 5 inches, that was a change. It was a change in a population, and it was a change over time. So that population went through biological evolution. That's all it is. If we come back and we see that it's a different percentage, then the population evolved. That's all that happened. There's 2 important points that we need to mention when talking about biological evolution. One is that living things descended from a common ancestor, and thus they have common chemistry. So this is one of the things over a lot of time we've been able to study this over and over repeatedly, and that's why evolution is a theory, because all of the studies we've done has supported that this happens over time. And because of that change in a population, all of those living things had a common ancestor at some point, and some of that chemistry that initial common ancestor had has been passed on through all of those generations. The other thing to point out is populations adapt to their environment. They're not going to adapt to a different environment because they don't even know, it's not even physically possible. It's only the environment that they are living in at the time. And if that environment changes, either by becoming wetter or drier or warmer or colder or just more severe on any of those things, then the population will still exist for a short while, and if any of the individuals in that population are resistant to whatever the change is, then they'll be more successful in that new environment and then become more prolific in that new environment if they can reproduce. So that's where we see biological happening. Populations are evolving, not individuals, and they are adapting to their environment, nothing else, and living things have a common ancestor. Now, adaptation is a term, and the word adapt are things that we use interchangeably a lot in our common language. But when we're talking about evolution, they have very specific meanings. So adaptation, unadaptation, is a characteristic or a trait that enables an organism to survive and reproduce in its environment. Note that an adaptation, a characteristic, is the result of DNA. And oftentimes a new characteristic, or always a new characteristic, is from a mutation in the DNA. So that's how we get various skin pigmentations and eye pigmentations and hair pigmentations, and how tall you are, or how easily you gain or lose weight, or how flexible you are. Those things, a lot of those things are characteristics that you gained from your DNA. So an adaptation is just a characteristic. Natural selection is not the same thing as evolution. Natural selection is the process or the mechanism by which a species becomes adapted to an environment. So we'll outline natural selection in just a moment, but my analogy here is when you boil an egg. When you start with a raw egg and you put it in hot water, when it comes out after about 12 minutes, if it's boiling water, you have a solid egg. You have a hard-boiled egg. Now, that was a change. That was not evolution because we didn't see a change in DNA and we didn't see a change in a population. That was just one individual. But the point is that boiling is the mechanism by which we had the change from raw to hard-boiled egg. Heat was the mechanism that did that, and that's what we're pointing out with natural selection. Natural selection is the mechanism or the process by which a species, a population, becomes adapted to an environment, becomes more likely to thrive in that environment. So this at first was proposed by Charles Darwin. Most people know his name by now, and so he traveled the world for about 4 or 5 years on the HMS Beagle, and he was looking at all these different species that he was finding in birds and plants and things in the water and looking at rocks and just putting it all together. And then he sat on that information for about 16 years and was trying to put it all together. And he eventually did in a book called On the Origin of Species and published it. And I mean, he knew it was going to cause a lot of ruckus. He was actually a very religious person, and so he knew that people were going to take issue with it because at the time a lot of folks thought that God had just created the world and he'd created it as we live in it right now. It hadn't changed at all. And he was saying, well, actually, all of the things that we've observed on this, other people, not just me, everything that we've observed shows that things have changed. And he proposed this natural selection mechanism that would describe how that would even be possible. So here's what was outlined by Darwin. Natural selection. He was kind of like, okay, if this really is going to be true, here are some things that would have to be true for it to even work. So your book gives you 3 vital elements. I add a 4th one. Oh, half of the other books that I've read have a 4th one, and I think it just helps put it all together. So variation means physical variations have to exist in the population. So again, this is what has to be existing, or this is what has to happen for natural selection to even happen. So we have to have variations. That means we have to have different sizes, different heights, different colors, different you know, maybe different fat contents or ability to add fat or take away fat. Those are physical variations. They have to exist. Color is a good one. Or height. Heritability is the one that isn't explicitly stated, but it's very often it's stated in many other texts, so we're including it. Is heritability points out that those variations, that height, that color difference, needs to be able to be passed on to offspring. If that was not true, then natural selection wouldn't work. And Darwin was saying that. He's like, all right, if it just ends with you and it has nothing to do with your offspring, then this doesn't work at all. But what we know now, you can look at your parents and you can look around us. We've established this very clearly with today's science, is that variations are passed on. The third part that Darwin pointed out was that, okay, a population has to have competition. There has to be competition so the best adapted will survive and reproduce. That has to be true. If it's not true, then everybody will just be equal and it'll just be totally random. And the 4th piece was adaptation. The subsequent generations will see an increase in individuals with the same adaptations if we're in the same environment. So when we look at the giraffe example on the far right, Darwin's proposal, originally our giraffe neck length varied, and the really tall ones were able to eat the food, and the shorter ones were not able to eat the food. And there was competition for that food, and only the ones with that long neck were able to survive. Then they were able to pass on that variation, that long neck, to their offspring, versus the short neck giraffes were not able to pass on their variations because they died. So you're not able to reproduce when you're dead. And then as a result, that subsequent population, that subsequent generation, for the most part, all had long necks. And that would have just been passed on over time. Lamarck was someone else who was working on this at the same time. On the left, we've since shown that Lamarck's proposal is not supported by science. And the idea there was that giraffes had short necks, and then they'd stretch their necks, and then with continual stretching, now they have long necks. And that's kind of what we would call acclimation, but acclimation is, you know, being able to say, oh, it's cold outside, I'm going to go find shelter. That's making an immediate behavioral decision, versus Lamarck was proposing that, like, your body would actually grow extra bones in order to make a longer neck if you were a giraffe to reach food. And we know now that that's not true. All right, so there is a lot of evidence to support the theory of evolution by common descent. Now, remember that theory means we have tons of evidence to support it, and cell theory is on the same page with the theory of evolution. And for the most part, nobody's really arguing that cells aren't living and cells don't lead to other cells, right? We have all this information that supports cell theory, and the theory of evolution is on the same par, the same level, science-wise, with the theory of cells. So we're going to go through these 4 major lines of evidence: the fossil record, biogeographical evidence, anatomical evidence, and biochemical evidence. And remember, we're never going to say prove, and that sometimes bothers people because they want that really solid answer. But as scientists, we have to always leave a little bit of room for information later. Maybe later on we will learn more and we will say, oh, we have to tweak the theory of evolution in order with this new information in light. And that would certainly cause a stir, but we always have to leave room for that. So we call it a theory, but in science, that theory is supported over and over by evidence, so much so, and without any contradicting evidence, that we are very, very confident that it is existing and that it will continue to happen. So, running through these lines of evidence. Fossils. Fossils are fantastic. They're so cool. And they allow us to actually trace the descent of a group. So fossils are the leftover bones of an organism, or at least the mineralized bones of an organism. Sometimes we can get more if it's a really unique situation where the organism died very quickly and was either buried by a landslide or something very, very fast. Sometimes even the contents of their stomach and imprints of other softer tissues can still exist. But for the most part with fossils, we're looking at mineralized bones structure. And so Darwin relied largely on fossils to formulate his theory of evolution of natural selection. And transitional fossils are fossils that have characteristics of two different groups. So the discussion video that you're going to watch is all about this organism here, Tiktaalik, the species that was found in that the video outlines how that happened. And Tiktaalik was really unique because it was a transitional fossil. It was found in the certain type of rock that was carbon dated to the amount of time, millions of years ago, 370 million years ago, where we start seeing in between there. Before then, we see all these aquatic organisms, and after there we see aquatic and terrestrial organisms, but we don't have this middle organism that shows when those aquatic species came on land. But Tiktaalik was a fossil, a transitional fossil that had those features. So we're going to point out right what we see. So in Tiktaalik, they had scales. We have imprints to show they had scales, and so did fish. And they also had fins, and so do fish. But fish have eyes on either side of their head and a rounded head, versus terrestrial early amphibians have a flat head with eyes on top, and that's what we see in Tiktaalik as well. We also see a neck in Tiktaalik, which is absent in fish but present in amphibians, and we see expanded ribs, which allow for breathing on land. So we see features, we see characteristics from amphibians, and we see characteristics from fish in this transitional fossil of Tiktaalik, which is just super cool. All right, the fossil record also allows us to see some other things. It tells us that life has progressed from simple to complex. Things have gotten more complex with time. It tells us that the life started as prokaryotes and then moved to unicellular eukaryotes and then to multicellular eukaryotes. It shows us that fish evolved before terrestrial plants and animals, non-flowering plants preceded flowering plants, amphibians preceded reptiles, and dinosaurs are directly linked to birds. So there's a lot of other things that the fossil record tells us. These are just a few things that I kind of pulled out because they tend to be interesting to folks. We're finding more and more and more evidence that dinosaurs are directly linked to birds, and more evidence that dinosaurs, some of them anyway, had feathers as opposed to scales, which is what we previously thought. So yeah, just lots of cool new research going on. But remember, all of this depends upon an organism dying at an exact time in an amount of dirt or soil or water, and then being covered usually very quickly, and then that particular soil not going down into the earth, not being eroded at some point, you know. So a lot of things do have to happen in just the right way for a fossil to be maintained until today. And the more that we have ice caps melting, you know, although that's not great for the planet and cooling and humans, and we'll talk about that later, the one thing it is doing is actually allowing us to access some of the rocks that are underneath it and potentially finding new fossils and more information. So, you know, it's an interesting business, archaeology, but it allows us to see so much into the past, and certainly there's still gaps, but there's a lot of information that we've been able to get out of it. All right, biogeographical evidence. So biogeography is the study of the distribution of plants and animals throughout the world, and essentially, so you pull up a map and you say, okay, where do we find marsupials? And you kind of outline it. Where do we find kangaroos? Where do we find possums? Where do we find wolves? And where do we find moose? And you kind of outline that in the world, and then you make note of what that means. You know, for moose, we see that they're not any further north than a certain point, and we can look at plants and we can say, okay, yeah, there just simply aren't enough plants up there to support moose. So that's kind of explaining that. And we look, okay, they don't go any further south than this particular point. Oh, well, they're just too hot then, because we know that moose get heat stressed at this temperature, and below that point, you know, southern point, they'll just be too hot. They won't be able to survive. So that would explain why we find them in this particular part of the world. But what we also see is that when we look from continent to continent and islands and even in the water too, what we can see is biogeography is constantly supporting the hypothesis that organisms originate in one location and then spread out and diversify in their various environments. So if we see moose originating in country X, and then we find fossils of moose or even existing moose in different areas. You know, when we see them in Alaska, they're a little bit bigger. When we see them further south, they're a little bit smaller. You know, and so we're pointing out that they've diversified in those different environments. Different life forms, what we've seen, are expected, especially when geography separates them. So when a river separates them, or a mountain, or a valley, or a desert, or some sort of dramatic geography is separating two populations, then those different populations are going to diversify and possibly eventually be two totally different species. So that's what we're looking at. And remember, a river, you might say, well, a river's really small, you can cross that. And that might be true if you're a butterfly, or if you're a deer or a bear, but if you're a squirrel or a mouse, crossing a river is really pretty tough. So, you know, we have to think about what size and which organism we're talking about for each of these. And we just want to point out here, too, that islands, think of Madagascar, think of the Florida Keys, think of the Bahamas, we can think of, you know, Tahiti or the Galapagos. All of those islands have a really unique species, and that's because they have geographic isolation. They are so isolated from other organisms for so long that the only genetic pool that they have to draw from is what's on the island and what mutations just randomly happen to occur. And so that kind of almost limits them, but it also allows them to just become very, very unique. So that's kind of another piece we see here. So anatomical evidence, there's some great examples of this in the video you'll watch for the discussion. We have 2 or 3 things here on the next few slides. So the first are homologous structures. So homologous structures are anatomically similar because they were inherited from a common ancestor. And what we see on the left is we see, in all of these, we see 1 bone here, we see 2 bones here, we see a little clump of something here for bones, and then we see kind of this dividing bone structure over here. This one happens to be fused, but we have 1, 2, a little clump, and then some very long bones. So, and we can see that in the whale and the cat and the horse and the human. We see that pattern over and over again. And that's because that pattern was inherited from a common ancestor. And that ancestor wasn't a bird, it wasn't a bat, it wasn't any of these things. It was some other organism that, you know, that initial amphibian tetrapod probably had something similar too. I guess I don't know its bone structure offhand, but, you know, that common ancestor had a really similar structure, and that's just been inherited over time. We also see it with development. So in pig embryos and chick embryos and even some other embryos, they have something called pharyngeal pouches, and we can see them in the embryos. Humans have them too. A post-anal tail, even if that tail disappears before the organism is born, it exists as an embryo. So developmentally, we develop along a really similar line. And again, you'll see that in the video. Other anatomical evidence includes analogous structures and vestigial structures. So analogous structures are structures that serve the same function, but they do not share a common ancestor. And we just want to point this out because we do want to know the difference. So these are things like wings, bird wings, bee wings, bat wings. They're all constructed differently. And they're all serving the function of allowing flight, but they all evolved separately. And the reason we know they evolved separately is because they're not constructed the same way. Vestigial structures are anatomical features that are fully developed in one group, but they are reduced or gone, and they may have no function at all in another group. So a great example of this is that whales have a vestigial pelvic girdle and vestigial legs. So 500 million years ago, we had this large creature that was able to walk on land, but it looks like it was also able to go on the water, right? And you have some webbing between the feet here, because whales, all our marine mammals have returned to water. They've evolved from land creatures. So being on land, terrestrial, means you wanted legs, you wanted a pelvic girdle. Just think of your hips. Well, as this organism started spending more and more time in the water, 10 million years later, we get to 4 million years ago, now we have this minimized pelvic girdle and this little foot. And the foot is still there. We found this in the fossil record. We see this little foot hanging out, but it's all entirely inside the body. Check this out. Here's the edge of the body, and this little foot, these bones, are still being produced, but because they're not needed, they're just very, very small, hanging out in the body, basically doing nothing. And even today, in our modern whales, we still have these bones, this very now primitive pelvic girdle happening, 500 million years after it was needed, but it still hangs out, it's still made in the body. So that's a little vestigial structure. It's very reduced. It, to our knowledge, has no function. But that's that vestigial trait, because we can see it over time in the fossil record, slowly becoming more and more reduced. All right, and then this last section is, or line of evidence, is biochemical evidence. And basically, we're just pointing out here, we've said this before, all living things use the same biochemicals. They all have ATP, they all have DNA. The DNA is often combined into genes that are very, very similar. When we look at differences, we can look at amino acid differences in certain genes, and we can see that there's only 2 differences between, pardon the dog. We also see that living things, use the same triplet genetic code. So when we think about DNA, that makes proteins, the little code, we didn't go into it, but the code of AAA or ACA or GGG or GGC or TGA, those combinations are triplets, and that's what leads to amino acids. And then we also see that all organisms use the same 20 amino acids. There aren't any others that just magically appear in any other organisms. We all use the same 20 amino acids, even the bacteria that get you sick, the bacteria that keep your stomach healthy, the monkeys, everything you can think of that's living uses the same 20 amino acids. And so that again supports that we came from a common ancestor that also used those 20 amino acids.